Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lorraine Robles, Director of Development Services and Neighborhood Revitalization for the San Antonio Housing Authority. I'll be your moderator. I'm happy to let you know that you have an incredible set of panelists before you. But before we allow them to introduce themselves, let me give you an overview of the topic for this session. This session will cover SAHA residents have a sufficient supply of affordable housing options. Today, the demand of housing affordable to low-income households in San Antonio vastly outstrips supply. We know this. This imbalance varies significantly by area, and there are entire neighborhoods without homes that are affordable to low-income households. The situation is getting worse as rents and home prices increase, and while incomes stagnate. This creates serious equity problems in the region and impacts the health, education, and employment outcomes of individuals and families. In this session, we will explore the path forward in providing quality, affordable housing to all those who need it. As our chairwoman stated this morning, SAHA residents are all residents that the agency serves, regardless of the housing program, whether it's subsidized or unsubsidized housing, both current and future residents of San Antonio. In developing some potential strategies, SAHA conducted a series of meetings with both internal and external participants, from staff members of various departments to residents, partners, stakeholders, and other housing providers. Through our discussions, that led us to 3 strategies. These 3 strategies are: 1, increase overall supply of housing affordable to low-income households; 2, increase the proportion of housing affordable to very low-income households, 50% of AMI and below, in each new development; and 3, increase the number and proportion of housing units in priority areas. So in new areas, census tracts or council districts where SAHA does not have a presence either physically or through vouchers. Also in neighborhoods of opportunity. So through these discussions, they led to ideas about how we could accomplish this. And so we thought about maybe land banking, acquiring existing properties where we could infuse affordable housing units, creating new developments, of course, but in these target areas in census tracts where we don't have a presence, promoting voucher acceptance by landlords, again, in these same areas, and also utilizing different building materials, those that are less expensive, but still good quality and sustainable. Today, as our interim CEO mentioned, is a day of learning for us and garnering further insight by having honest conversations about the creation of affordable housing and the hurdles or barriers that we must overcome to move the needle. So as we move through the process this afternoon, we want to keep in mind 2 overarching questions. The first, as you've heard throughout the day, is housing as a human right and anticipations for changing administration. Now, while I'll be asking the initial questions to the panelists, please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. And we're gonna make sure to reserve some time at the end to answer these questions. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and have each panelist introduce themselves, state their agency and the work that they do. And Tim, we're gonna start with you.
Sure, yep. I'm Tim Alcott, and I'm with San Antonio Housing Authority, and I oversee the real estate department and development. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation today.
Thank you, Tim. Dr. Kamal?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Azza Kamal. I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation at South Alamo Regional Alliance for the Homeless, known as SAHA. I'm also adjunct professor at Texas State University teaching urban and regional planning.
Thank you, Azza. Jason?
My name is Jason Arechiga, Senior Vice President of the NRP Group. I specialize in affordable and workforce housing. My territory is the state of Texas, and additionally, other housing options, market rate options, and blended options for San Antonio.
Thank you, Jason. Christine?
Hello, my name is Christine Vigna. I'm the Project Manager for Urban Design for Via Metropolitan Transit in the Strategic Planning Division. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Ryan?
Hello. Before I introduce myself, I want you to recognize that I took myself off mute. I'm so proud of myself. That was pretty good for me. My name is Ryan Wilson. I'm a senior partner at Franklin Companies. We're a developer, builder, and manager of both multifamily, affordable workforce, as well as senior housing, including independent living, assisted living, and memory care. and we've been doing this for about 20 years here, mostly local San Antonio. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for joining. And last but not least, Pete.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pete Alanese. I'm the Executive Director for the San Antonio Housing Trust.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And so we're going to hit the ground running and start with housing as a human right. Since it's been a topic that is being contemplated across the nation, what are your thoughts regarding this statement? And Aza, would you like to start?
Sure. I think housing and housing shortage in the region is no foreign topic to everyone who lives in San Antonio or who lived here, particularly for the past 15 years, seeing the shortage, but also the challenge of policy providers and developers in coping with the increased gap between those who have and those who don't have. Unlike some other states, we don't have flexibility. And when I say we, I'm talking about the program delivery and the housing unit delivery sectors. Cannot actually address the housing as a human right with all these hurdles in the law, in land use, in a housing market dictated by the development. And I'm not finger pointing anyone. This is an inherited market driven community and communities and metropolitan areas. In other states, there's been discussion about different creative housing policy and housing plan that integrate within existing communities and in new development, a lot of affordable housing stock. Also considering transportation, now we have Christine Vinya on the call, how to align the housing as a human right with access to transportation, which is a big burden and a big out-of-pocket money that add to the overall hurdles on the low income, very low income and extremely low income, particularly 30% or below. I know it's covered in the strategic plan of SAHA, but we see it a lot at SAHA for our clients. And for the data we have been tracking on the eviction prevention program by the city, we see a lot of high proportion for the extremely low income. And you're talking in your strategic next step of implementation about the proportion of affordable to the market rate. And just it's worth mentioning the income level also proportion is worth addressing.
Agreed. And thank you for that. Christine, did you want to chime in? Because as we know, we've been talking throughout the day, and our priorities, again, are not just about housing, but we also talked today about the importance of affordable utilities, which include, access to Wi-Fi and internet. But we also know that a big part of our residents' expense is transportation. Mm-hmm. So Christine, what do you think?
A lot. No, sometimes, no, I certainly, when, coming from the transportation side of it, we like to say, H plus T, and we can't look at a household income unless we absolutely link those together. And as a transit agency, we tend to, we are not a housing provider, but we follow kind of development patterns. And so to the extent that development is located along transit corridors or along those corridors where we have high frequency transit, then we can start to look at the decision-making power of both the development community and residents. What I typically like to have the analogy is when you go to look for a place to live, you have a list of I need this, I need this, I need this. I need this number of bedrooms, this number of bathrooms. And for some reason I need a big yard. If I'm working 2 jobs, because at midnight I like to take care of my yard. And access to public transit is not generally on the top of that list. And if we start to switch the paradigm of where do I work or where do I desire to work or to send my kids to school, and can I take that big chunk of dollars that's generally associated with transportation costs and eliminate that to the extent possible by allowing myself access to great frequent transit, what does that do to my household income, especially over time, to create wealth? And if you do a simple equation about the amount of money that you put toward a vehicle and its cost in a year, and you put that toward a mortgage or toward housing, the ability to afford a higher level of housing and or save up in small amounts over time to create wealth through home ownership. So we work very closely with the Housing Authority because the customer base is a lot of the same folks, and want to make sure that we also work with the city in terms of planning. And then lastly, I'll mention that through some of the UDC revisions that we'll see over the next year, we are focusing on being able to have more dense housing along transit corridors at all income levels to be able to help support the future for people who need housing and can make that decision to live near transit.
No, that is great news. Our housing providers, would anyone like to weigh in?
I can. So, with our residents, their biggest expenses are, transportation, food, and housing. And so what Christine is talking about is how can they make their lives better? Because with transportation and workforce housing near downtown or near job centers, they don't have those big expenses, for transportation. And with the housing nearby, with what we build is very affordable housing, they save there as well. So they should be in much better position. But as the next 3 or 4 people are going to speak was Jason, Ryan, and Pete. They're all, developers. And, what I was trying to think about is, or to discuss is how can we make sure, if housing is a human right, that these people can live with security. And some thoughts I had was, could we overlay vouchers on top of tax credit units? And so therefore, if they have a change of income and things of that nature, that then they would only have to pay 1/3 of their income. And if you have a typical tax credit unit, if you lose your job, you still have to pay the tax credit rent. But if you have a voucher on top of it, then your rent is reduced. It doesn't negatively impact the development, but then SAHA just has a bigger subsidy. And so, I think ideas like that would add a lot. But the other problem we have is, as we're trying to build affordable housing, is that minimum wage is so low. And we saw with the Biden administration. And as we're trying to build, affordable housing and trying to, make the numbers work and financially pencil, and people are making, I don't know what the minimum wage is, I should know this, but it's like $7.50 an hour or something extremely low. And I've heard, on the news, $15 an hour, but it's really hard for folks to certainly either rent a place or certainly home ownership at $7.50 an hour. And so wage stagnation is a big problem. Pete's probably going to mention that we know there's not enough money for affordable housing. The city has to issue housing bonds and things of that nature to fill these gaps. And so, I think there's a lot to it on housing as a human right and how do you tackle it. And so those are several of the issues. I'll pass it on to the rest of the group.
Now, and with those comments, with our developers, so how do you feel about the layering that Tim just mentioned?
Let me see if I can hop in. First off, I'm not an actual developer. We are an entity that does partner with other nonprofits and for-profits to help create housing opportunities. And, I want to just real quick, just make sure I touch back to human rights. Housing is human right. That really does translate into tenants' rights, specifically how that landlord and tenant relationship can be better fostered. I think right now in our community, there's a lot of tension there. And, I'm happy that the Housing Trust was able to pass just at our last board meeting, a proposed tenant protection policy that will be able to kind of outline within the framework of the existing law what we can actually help accomplish in terms of rights for tenants, making sure that there's no retaliatory actions, making sure there's a right to information. We want to be able to make sure that the folks who we do partner with are going to be good partners. They're not going to be bad actors. And I think that's a step for our organization to move in that direction. So it's taking the leap, yes, from human rights, but also tenant rights are extremely important. I thank you for the softball regarding the bond program. Part of what it takes to construct an affordable housing project, especially when you're trying to deep target the 0 to 50 AMI thresholds, is you need adequate financial tools to be able to do that. And yes, there's debt. You have to go to a bank to get a loan, a construction loan, a permanent loan, to be able to build the product that you're building. But that is not the only resource. You have to have a source of equity. And typically developers have utilized tax credit equity to be able to fund these projects, because those tax credit equity dollars don't require return like private equity dollars do. And if we are to continue to figure out ways that we can achieve that lower AMI threshold, we have to find other cash resources available in our community. I think the bond program would be ideal for that, in order to figure out a way to target the 50% AMI level or below. Our tax exemption tool is just not capable of being able to drive the 50% and below units like we desperately need in our communities. So I wanted to throw that out there, because I think that's important, that if there is a bond vote that provides dollars, we want to make sure that's income targeted, and those dollars go and are spread across our community in a very equitable way. And I think that's a very important term that we need to keep hounding over and over. How do we provide our cash dollars into the community in an equitable manner? So thank you.
We agree. And thank you for that, Pete. Anyone else?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pete. I think a lot of it has to do with what we're talking about right now as part of an education process that's a very important thing to people as a whole. So to backtrack a little bit about housing as a human right, it's misquoted to Gandhi and a few other people, that quote that how society treats its most vulnerable is always a measure of its humanity. And that's basically how we're going to be judged. The United States in general is in a position to be able to take care of its most vulnerable, and should be, as essentially the leading nation in terms of economic wealth, and unfortunately dropping in certain aspects of health care and a variety of other things. But that's where we can start back at the beginning and re-examine what is a human right. And it takes an education process, because there are still some people out there, and I'm not pointing fingers, nobody probably on this call, but there are plenty of, nobody on the panelists for sure, but there are still plenty of people out there who look with a sort of aversion to even issuing the bonds for affordable housing, workforce housing, permanent supportive housing, for public housing, for housing as a human right, even, because there is still a strong contingent of the population that believes pull yourself by your own bootstraps and make it your own way, pay your own rent, no more assistance from anybody else. And so that there'll still be people that will be fighting against that. And we need kind of just even taking a back step as to educate them that this is why we need it. These programs themselves can only go so far. To just rely on, it's a conglomeration of everybody. It's city, state, and federal funds as well. It's the Biden administration, it's the state of Texas, and it's a city. Yeah, like Pete said, the city of Austin just recently passed $200 million in bonds for affordable housing. They're smaller than us. They have higher AMIs than us. They're slightly ahead of affordable housing. And while I love San Antonio, it's my home, I'm just saying that we could probably do a better job. And I think a lot of that has to do with people saying, well, is that really the best choice for our money at the moment? But that's the education process. Going back and saying housing is a human right. We need public transportation. Please invest in that. We need affordable and workforce housing. We need all housing for everybody. Not for, there's 250,000 people moving in here. What was it in the next couple of years? We need housing for everybody, but especially that type of housing. So I'll just conclude with saying, yes, I believe housing is a human right. And I think we have more of that luxury here in the United States, in Texas, and in San Antonio, and an obligation with that luxury to be able to educate people and apply some more resources towards it, because it is kind of a trickle up thing. The more we can help people that are the most vulnerable, the more it can start feeding back to everyone else.
Well said, Jason. Thank you. And I wanted to give Ryan an opportunity before we go to the next question, if he'd like to chime in or weigh in.
Yeah, certainly. And again, I'm off mute, so kudos to me. I'm going to repeat what the panelists said. I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, housing is certainly a human right, especially if you're engaging and contributing to society. But one thing I do want to touch on that Jason said, he talked about affordable housing. And I personally, I hate that term when people say affordable, because that's all relative. I mean, we all live in affordable housing compared to Bill Gates. So affordable housing is a misnomer. And we like to use the term workforce housing, because what we're really trying to help here is the folks who are working that still can't afford necessarily a safe, decent, quality, affordable place to live. And to what Tim said earlier, at the end of the day, as I tell my wife, this is just a math equation. You know, we are trying to help the folks that are working, that, as mentioned, they're making $7.50 an hour. That's not enough in today's society to adequately house and clothe and feed your kids. It's just not possible. And then you throw transportation there, it's even worse. So the math equation is very simple. It costs a certain amount to build these. It costs a certain amount to operate. And I think it's us as a whole, as Jason really nailed on the head, is from Biden to state of Texas, to Bexar County, to city of San Antonio, to our individual communities and neighborhoods to provide that gap, that assistance, because without it, it's just physically not possible. So we can talk about programs, but at the end of the day, it's literally about trying to cobble together enough funding so that we can make that math equation work. And as we all know, the deeper discounting or deeper targeting you go, say from 60% to 50, all the way down to 30, that problem becomes that much more amplified. So that's the issue we have. And I agree with the human right issue, but I thought I'd throw that out there for my thought on affordable housing.
Well, no, I thank you, because that was a perfect segue into the next question. Because what is affordable housing? You know, I know we grapple with that every day. We're asked about it. What is the definition? How do we define it? We speak in terms of affordable workforce, AMIs, but what is affordable housing? What does that mean, especially to our most vulnerable? Who wants to start?
HUD defines it as, I'm sorry, Pete, go for it. You do it.
I love this question because we're going to discuss this in our Housing Commission meeting. You know, I look at, when you define affordability, a lot of people look at it with one view in mind. It has to do with targeting your investments and to make sure that we prioritize the lowest bands, right? And that's more of income targeting. But really, in my mind, there are 5 components that come along with defining affordable housing. Number 1 is, can you afford your home, right? Individual household affordability, right? We have to have a definition that clearly defines the individual household affordability. What AMI band would I want to apply to my particular program? That's called income targeting. And that's something that needs to be defined. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later at Housing Commission. I hope everybody jumps onto that later. We also have the area targeting of resources, right? Where should I focus my public programs and my efforts? And doing that through an equity lens and making sure there's that where you invest your dollars meet the needs of the communities that have been inequitably disadvantaged for years and years and years, right? So that needs to be part of that definition. Population targeting. What segment of our community should we be investing in? Are we talking about addressing senior citizens, persons with disabilities? What actual segment of the population, low-income residents with families? What sort of focus should we have when applying that affordability definition or lens? And then finally, the affordability period. How long is this unit expected to be affordable? And making sure we have policy behind that. So for me, there's 5 components when it comes to defining affordability.
Thank you, Pete.
I would like to add also, thank you, Pete. This is very, very informative and thorough. I would like to add also addressing barriers to access to housing, because some people may came out of incarceration, or people who had, unfortunately, during the pandemic or even before, situation where they had to switch between jobs and they lost their residence. And if they went through the court and they have the eviction on their record, they're likely to be asked, if they become eligible, to pay 3 times deposit to rent a unit. I'm not quite sure, maybe educate me how that's also gonna stand out as a barrier to get a mortgage. But I'm assuming it's gonna be the same if they have a history of eviction. We have seen that when in my work with Habitat for Humanity in Bryan, Texas. So source of income is another factors, the barriers that's in their record when addressing their affordability options. And the program, now we have a program called PLACE, administered by my organization, sponsored by the city of San Antonio, is working to mitigate those barriers. Also, the education component, Jason talked about, this is #1 priority, I think, for all agencies. Not only about the bond program, I think the bond program, also among the people who would likely use the bond program for their own benefit. We have historically low voting rate. So educating the people about what the bond program will entail and bring them is one important issue. I'm not saying that no one is doing that, but I think we need to do better as a community, that the bond program is not just a term, it comes with a lot of flexibility in terms of the land use and in terms of the development cost, location. I've reviewed myself the terms of assessment. It was my first task when I was working in the city of San Antonio 3 years ago, that to look over how the evaluation happened. It's very highly connected areas, it's access to transportation. So everything we're talking about as in terms of the quality of project that could be delivered in these bond sites. So expanding that program is one of the steps to continue to support creative approaches to have additional, or to maximize the supply of affordable housing is not the only way. There's many, many ways beyond the typical LIHTC or CDBG or home funded project. There's many ways that other communities have invested in, and it could be developed.
And that was such an important point to make, is that we're not only looking at, can an individual or family afford this unit or this home, but also taking their individual circumstance into consideration, not knowing what has happened in the past, and being able to work with them so that they can find a home or find housing. So excellent point. Thank you for that, Asa. Is there anyone else who wants to weigh in?
Sure. I was just going to say, you got to start somewhere, right? When you're defining what affordable housing is. It is relative to everyone. So HUD basically says, and this is not perfect, it's not, but that's why I say you have to start somewhere. HUD defines 30 to 33% of your income, right? I mean, as Ryan said, what is that for how much does Bill Gates spend on his housing bill? If he wanted to spend 33%, then he could live in a $30 billion home, a year. But it's not really relative as it works down. And there's a lot of factors that go in it. To Christine, what she was saying with public transportation, you can do 30% of your overall income, but if you live super far away from public housing and you're a 30% AMI, it's not, those other extraneous factors add up on top of that into where it makes your housing not necessarily as affordable. Or I could afford to pay a little bit more because I live right next to my job, right next to my school, so it's location specific too on what helps to make it. What ultimately, going back to the topic of this actual panel, is does SAHA have enough housing options? And honestly, I might be a little contrarian to say, I think that they actually do. There is enough options out there. It's just, does everybody, including SAHA and everybody, the trusts, private developers, everybody, do we take advantage of all those particular options? For me, I don't like shutting the door on any option, whether it's public housing, 30%, Section 8, all the way to 80%, 60% are pure market rate housing. right? It's a need for all. So I guess when you define that affordable housing, for me, I say it can also be, the last thing I would add to that is actually location specific too, can really affect all of it.
Agreed, agreed. And before we go to our next panelist, I just want to remind everybody that's participating in the call that you can post your questions on the Q&A at the bottom. And who else would like to weigh in? Tim.
I'll add on to what Jason said, because I agree with him. There are a lot of options out there. And so, San Antonio Housing Authority, if we talk about affordable housing, we have three main options. And that is the Section 8 program, which is vouchers. We have about 13,000 people that participate in that. Another program for affordable housing is our public housing units. And we have about 6,000 units there. And with both Ryan and Jason, we've also partnered with both of them to build a heck of a lot of tax credit developments. And we have about 4,800 tax credit partnerships, units, and about 3,200 that we own internally, 100% of with our Beacon portfolio. And so what we try and do at SAHA is do all the above, because we need housing across the city. We need plenty of options, for our residents, because they're in different life circumstances. Some may be better for public housing because they have a very, very low income. They can, or have no income. And so the rent is as low as $50 a month. With a voucher, they have more flexibility, but they may be living in a house and have different lease agreements and other issues that they have to deal with with whoever their homeowner or landlord is. And then, of course, we have, all the tax credit properties. What's nice is that we have them all across the city, and different quality of housing. We have different price points, so people have options. And I think it's very important for SAHA to continue to do that, is build, and look at all these different areas to build, and not just be, just focus on one area, because I think there's a need for affordable housing across the city.
Agreed, agreed. We know of areas, as we mentioned, where we have no presence, where there is no opportunity for affordable housing. Who else would like to weigh in?
I'll just make a little follow-on comment about in some of those areas that you may not have a presence in, I would suspect are very low density areas. And public transit is not efficient when we go into areas of low density, of land use patterns that have cul-de-sacs. And so when you hear the argument of, well, VIA doesn't serve my community, or I have 1 hour service, well, there may be a reason for that. When we look at the, and Jason mentioned 250,000 people, we're looking at, we say 1 million over the next, till 2040. Density and the intensity of that development is going to have to play into it. And the more dense of environment one is able to live in, the better transit service you're going to have access to. So I think there's also going to be an education program, and we may or may not get into the NIMBYism factor here, but I'm always astounded in many major cities when you're advertising real estate or vacation places to live, you'll always see 1 block to transit, transit stop at the front door. And here it's a kind of on its backside, it's like, get me away from that transit stop. And so until we start to build value that building near transit is considered an asset, and that density allows other amenities. And, as somebody who our population that may not access transit, they very well may access services that are performed by minimum wage earners. And so when you start to look at that equation, those services would not be available but for people who are able to have those jobs. And so I think we need to have a little bit more global perspective about how we integrate mixed income housing and address the stigma of not in my backyard for folks that might be of a different income strata.
Agreed. Agreed. And it's so
Hey,
important.
hey, Lorraine, do you
Yes.
mind if I piggyback on what Christine just said?
I would love for you to do that. Go ahead.
Okay, I think I already sort of, in my mind, defined what affordable is. It's all relative. And I think the one thing that we work really hard on as a community is trying to, as exactly Christine said, was trying to provide options in all of our communities, not just a certain segment of our community needs affordable housing. Affordable housing or workforce housing really is the basis of, is a huge portion of our population. And so all our workers need access to housing, whether it be in high-end areas of Alamo Heights or Stone Oak or in those neighborhoods. I think what we've tried really hard to do was make sure we, as a group, a community, define workforce housing as whatever that means for that community. Every community needs affordable options for housing. And as Jason mentioned, that's a sliding scale. If you're real close to the bus stop, or if you're real far away, or you spend more on schooling or other options, affordability can mean different things to different people. At the same time, I think it's important that we as a community realize that this needs to be in every corner of our community so people can take advantage in their particular corner of San Antonio. So that's all I wanted to add.
We agree. And you know, we forget about it. We miss it, but downtown, you know, right in our backyard. How important is that? We've got the transit, right? We have that amenity, those and tons of employment opportunities, but we're still lacking the affordable housing that we need downtown. So that's something.
Not coincidentally, Lorraine, is the sometimes hardest housing to build is downtown.
Exactly.
So the most barriers to entry are in some of the areas I just mentioned and downtown and some of the more expensive parts. That makes it that harder to provide, you know, workforce quality, safe, long-lasting, beautiful housing in all these communities. It's tough to do. So it's not an easy answer, but it does take a holistic approach to defining what affordable housing is and where we put it.
I agree. And again, perfect segue, Ryan. Thank you. Into the next question. What are some of the barriers to providing affordable housing options? And I want to say that I really appreciate the honesty and frankness in which we're speaking. And we've got a great, diverse panel today. So it's an opportunity for us to think outside the box. And if there are ideas that require changes, that we can mention them and talk through them, or plan. So who would like to start off on this question?
I don't mind. I'll start real quick just to kick it off. I think there are a lot of barriers to building and preserving affordable housing. I think one of the issues we're seeing that is strictly COVID related in the terms of the actual production has to do with your construction costs. And not necessarily the construction cost itself. I'm not talking about finished out stuff. I'm talking about the basic fundamental materials such as lumber. Those costs are they're just out the roof right now. And that is a result of factories being shut down, the supply chain being interrupted. Hopefully those will stabilize in the future. But for now, we're seeing a huge spike when it comes to the cost of constructing affordable housing. So that barrier, I think, along with not having an adequate supply of cash really required to inject into the project so you can attain the rent levels that you need, in my mind, are the big barriers. Construction costs and not enough cash within our public system to be able to really drive it down.
Thank you, Pete. Who would like to take it next?
I would go and would like to expand it more. I think our main barrier is the status quo. We're just doing the same thing, thinking we're gonna get the better results if we just added more units the same way we've been doing units for the past years, for the past couple of decades at least. Land value and land prices dictated by the market is a big barrier. Construction cost, I agree 100%. Before COVID, years before COVID, is a big barrier. Also, NIMBY, we all know, it's a big issue for most of the communities I lived in, including San Antonio. There's a lot of education and I think more of a trust of how the quality of the community that's serving affordable housing would look like. And that's an educational component from all those who are involved, whether they are making the decision, housing commission folks, they're doing a great job, by the way, and developers, city staff, so everyone, including us, my agency as well. I think thinking a little bit outside the box, there are great approaches for where to locate affordable housing, density bonuses, accessory dwelling units. This takes a little bit of time, but there are short-term and long-term strategic planning. I agree with Christina about the catchment needed for investment in transit and have the densities to support transit. This is a science supported by best practices, so inevitable to respect. But there is also short-term approaches that have been done in other cities that are referred to the work of folks at Turner Center in UC Berkeley that have been doing in kind of aligning where to add accessory dwellings or added densities in some areas that are vacant around that existing transit. So we can think ahead of the 2040 TODs, but we have a plan right now and routes exist. Some of the routes I've been on myself that go through a lot of dispersed areas and corridors. These are the ones that we can take steps immediately on. And with the land bank and community land trust, these are all ideas that could be prioritized in the agenda for the Housing Commission. One last thing I want to add, it's actually today's in Housing Commission, it's on the agenda, the income source discrimination ordinance is going to be discussed. I know you know that, Pete, but I just want to throw it here because I know we talked about it last week.
Very good. Thank you. Who else would like to weigh in?
You want me to weigh in? I'm gonna weigh in with something slightly controversial. Oh boy. So you want to know something a little interesting? Is people get sometimes bogged down with the cause du jour. Okay. How did people feel about deeper income 5 years ago? They did it was almost like, no, we need more mixed income. No, we need more of this. We need more blended. You got to put market rate units. You got to put market rate units. And now it's completely swung the other way, where usually you hear your public partners saying, you got to put the deepest targeting units. You got to put the deepest targeting unit, which I agree with, actually. I agree with that, with that sentiment. I do. However, there does need to be like a consensus of what you're looking at and who you're working with, who your private partner is and who your public partner is. And that can actually be a barrier sometimes, is that you have either one, including, I can be guilty of it too, including the private developer who's guilty of trying to put a round peg in a square hole. You know, where I was just, for instance, in a city in Dallas where they said, well, we love affordable housing, but not apartments. You got to do houses. And I said, yeah, that doesn't, the land value over here is $5 million. It doesn't work with this and this, with the uses and everything. I just don't think we could potentially make it work. Or we like affordable housing, but only for seniors, you know, I mean, and that's kind of an NIMBY factor too, that you run into as well. Now, while Ryan's great at doing senior housing, we do it too. But, you know, he's made it a lot of his portfolio and stuff. So it might be different for him as it would be for me. So sometimes we do have to look at who's bringing it, what the programs are available, and occasionally not mixing it so much up that we're trying to accomplish everything with every single deal. If we can get one deal that says we're doing 60s, 50s, and 40s here, or 60s, 50s, and 30s, or we're doing public housing and by all these 60s and percentages that I'm saying, folks, it's area median bands of targeting where we're going after people who make 60% of area median income, people who make 30%. When we're going after all these folks, and somebody says, well, now I also want you to put in XYZ, and we need to put in permanent supportive housing, which is great. We need that too. We need to put in public housing. Now we also need to put in market rate housing. it starts to get kind of convoluted and everything. And I guess occasionally we maybe need to take a step back and say, well, we're going to do that here because it's appropriate here close to public transportation, but we're not necessarily going to do it over here. And that's okay because it's going to come and mix out there. And so I think sometimes a barrier is we get so caught up in all these different things and these options that we can do that it can stagnate things. It's almost like a paralysis from too much.
Right, right. So yes, I think there's an educational process that needs to be undertaken that not only shows the faces of affordable housing, who is it that lives in these units, but also what is the rationale behind this mixed income or creating the different levels of income within a development, because it really comes down to the math for us, right? We have to build something that will house our families as well as sustain itself, because if not, it'll just deteriorate, right? So I think being able to educate our community about why we do the things we do and taking the time to do that is important. Who else would like to weigh in?
Yeah, Lorraine, I think I would, because you said that the exact same thing I was going to bring up was education. Jason, I'm sure, has been in public meetings where we are showing them pictures of these beautiful products that we deliver. The fact that we're personally guaranteeing these developments and we're involved in management for 40 years. All these are really good positive things. Yet you have 300 residents screaming, "No, we don't want that," in our backyard. So NIMBY is still a very real issue we deal with daily, and I want to take one step and to congratulate our city leaders that over the past couple of years they've listened to that and said, as a leader in our community, which this panel is, or we're leaders in our community, is continue to educate and allow our leaders to say, what, I know everyone wants a park next door to them, but at the same time, we as a community have to understand this is an extremely valuable cog in our housing stock. We need to pay serious attention to it. And I think the mayor with his housing task force absolutely sort of defined that. And so we applaud his leadership in doing that. But we as a community need to maintain and continue to educate, to let folks know in our communities, this is not anywhere near a bad thing. This is about the best housing that can be built. I mean, I'm a product of it myself, and so there's not those people. It's just us as a community. So I think NIMBY still is out there, and although we've taken strides in the past couple of years to counteract that. So as a barrier, I just wanted to throw it out there that we still deal with that on a daily basis, especially in some of the communities that need it most, which is the most barriers to entry. The higher income areas, Stone Oak or Dominion or areas like that historically say, no, somewhere else. Those are where we are facing the most uphill battles when we're trying to do what we do.
Agreed. And this has been a great conversation. We're going to have to get to questions in just a moment, but Christine, I want you to go ahead and weigh in.
Well, actually, I was reading some of the chat there and wanted to follow up with Azza about the out of the box thinking on products, and maybe what Ryan just said about some of those communities that have the highest NIMBY factors. Well, there tends to be a very low NIMBY factor for seniors. And since the the over 65 cohort is the largest growing in terms of demographics. And I think the trends say that in about 20, 25 years, 2/3 of households are not going to have children. And so what does that do to our product choice? And so I know in some other communities, very wealthy neighborhoods in other cities, there have been efforts to take kind of large mansions and make them into fourplexes for seniors, so that people in their community can age in place. And that would seem to be a very low threshold for being able to start to introduce some density at a limited scale in the community. Perhaps something like the Airbnb ordinance that we did, that took a lot of affordable housing with ADUs out of the community, because people who were renting them at a lower rate can now, prior to COVID, could make a lot of more money on those. And so maybe that's one product, scattered site infill with increased density for seniors.
Thank
Lorraine,
you for that. We're making note of that.
Lorraine, do you mind if I add a 15-second thing?
No, go ahead.
And thank you, Christine. I didn't mean to, I was just going back a second ago. When you were talking earlier, there's one thing that's a barrier to affordable housing that I forgot to mention, that it's very important that everybody knows. The state of Texas requires that if any tax credit deal is done, senior, family, doesn't matter, a resolution of no objection or a resolution of support by the local municipality is required. That's on top of a property that may already be appropriately zoned. Why is that onus on anybody if the property is appropriately zoned? Why do you have to go to do that? So there's one thing that, frankly, if it could eliminate, the cities and legislators should be discussing that and potentially getting rid of that. There's no reason to add that. I know some cities want it for that extra level of control, but that's why you have zoning. And that's why everything else is zoned. So if you're appropriately zoned, there should be no reason why they say the only reason we're not letting you go here is because you're affordable and we won't give you a resolution and no objection. That happens quite often. Interesting
point. Very interesting. So we're going to go ahead and get into the questions from the participants. And the first one is San Antonio Housing Trust looking at abandoned vacant buildings to incorporate into a portfolio of affordable housing trust?
Thank you. That's a great question. Right now, our public facility corporation tool looks at undervalued, vacant, underutilized, agriculturally exempt, city-owned property, which currently doesn't pay any sort of property taxes. We feel that's the best way that we can apply the tax exemption tool, because the land is tax exempt anyway. And that has been a big help in understanding how we can acquire that property, how we can redevelop it, and ensure that it continues on for affordable housing purposes. I think utilizing the trust as a land bank is definitely within the realm of the trust. I know the city does have, and I'm going to put the city on the spot a little bit, they do have city-owned property that I think would be pretty ideal for transferring over to the housing trust control. That way we can then work with the development community to get that housing built. And we accomplished one of them, or we're about to, with our Echo East development, where the city transferred the land to the housing trust, and then we're able to inject that into the project to help make it work. So we can achieve some 100% low-income rents at that project. So it's a model that we are familiar with. I think there's a big difference between going out, utilizing cash to acquire a particular property, and then sitting and holding it when you don't have a specific plan in place. It becomes very difficult to achieve and hard to roll out, but it is a possibility. I would want to develop a plan that actually says how we're going to dispose of that property for specific affordable housing uses and needs. And the city's already doing that in a sense with its Proposition 6 bond program. And we've done several projects, including a couple with Ryan Wilson over at Green Line and Park at 3830. So we're definitely well equipped to do that. We just need cash to acquire property.
And Susan Richardson, thank you for the question. What an excellent idea. With the growing need and demand for affordable housing, it makes sense to utilize abandoned and vacant buildings. So the next question is for Christine. To Christine's point, is it the lack of public transportation in areas of growth that add to our community being so economically segregated?
I'd say it's a factor. I mean, if you purposefully are building communities that, I always like to use the analogy of, if you take any square mile of inner city inside, 410, the number of roadways that you have access to and the grid system that's there, anybody can generally get to a transit stop in about half a mile. And if you look outside our area in fast growing pieces of our community and look at the street grid network, it is unsustainable in terms of providing transit access with many, many cul-de-sacs. If you look at the pedestrian way from a house to a gated entry point to then an arterial road where a bus stop might be located, it's not feasible, and it's really unsustainable. So to the extent that you have a very segregated income strata in that community that generally objects to being connected to the next community, yes, unfortunately, I think the answer is yes.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Rachel, for that question. The next question is increasing all purpose-built rental rates will decrease the yearly rental rate suffer.
I think it's more a statement. Lorraine.
Yeah, I do
Let's
too.
move on to the next one.
And I apologize, I'm reading it very poorly. Increasing all purpose-built rentals rate will decrease the yearly rental rate, while squeezing supply will make housing affordability suffer. And thank you for your statement.
I think I can help address that. I mean, the overall housing supply in San Antonio, at all levels, there is a need for it, right? I think we, of course, want to look at prioritizing the needs of our cash resources from the 0 to 50 and 60% AMI thresholds. But there is still a need for housing across the board. And not only today, but the projection of, over the next 5 to 10 years, as our city continues to grow. And rent growth is specifically tied to supply and demand. And that's just a reality. And the less supply of housing we have, the higher the rents across the board are going to increase, except for rent restricted units that have LORAs, that have PFC, a tax credit type of controls to keep that rent growth from going higher and higher.
Thank you, Pete, for that. And thank you for the statement. And the next one is, are there any policies limiting land use for development?
Lorraine, I
We
think
have
those
another hour for a panel.
I know.
The answer is yes, sure. Zoning, comprehensive plans, future land use maps, you name it. Yeah, of course there is. And so, and then there's actual policies too that can say we limit the stuff for this and everything. Yeah, there is. But it would take a whole, unless, I don't know if you guys want to add anything else, that would take.
Well, the qualified allocation plan.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. There's all sorts of things.
There are many. So thank you for that.
Well, I would say as a planner, I'm a big believer in the neighborhood planning process. And to the extent that it may limit it, I think there's a big effort now in the planning effort that the city is managing, to look at community by community, knowing that you're going to have to accommodate housing and especially affordable housing in that community. Okay, where would I put it? I don't have the option of saying, no, I don't want it. So if I'm going to have to accept it, let's plan appropriately for where that might be appropriate within our community. So I think some of the plans today are lending themselves better than they have in the past to that.
Yeah, not a bad, good point. Very useful.
Okay, here's our last one. This is interesting. Thoughts on eliminating single family zoning, especially in near downtown neighborhoods and within 410. This is from the NowCap team. Anybody want to weigh in on that thought?
The first thing that comes to my mind is when you're densifying an area, what does that do to the fabric of that community? I think it would have, I want to think that through a lot on whether or not eliminating single family zoning, and then you're creating 4 or 5 units on one 60 by 120 lot. I think is going to present a lot of challenges. That's an interesting discussion item.
Mm-hmm. And
the people who live there, they wouldn't. You couldn't. You're familiar with the Tier 1 neighborhood, a lot of coalition and everything, and they've got some valid points too. They want to preserve to a certain degree. You are moving high density, but they want to preserve where they live too, and the culture and fabric of that neighborhood. So you kind of have to balance both, and so it's tough for the people that live there. All their houses would now be non-compliant.
Agreed. And we still have a couple more questions, but we're running out of time. And I know that one of our panelists needs to leave promptly. And so I want to thank everybody for joining today and participating. And I ask that you please consider moving on to the next session, which starts at 3:45, and it will address SAHA residents have sufficient food, water, and clothing. And any of the questions that are, we have about 2 more questions that are left that we can try to hit quickly. As I know you've got to leave, but the rest of my panelists, are you willing to take it real quick?
Mhm.
Yes, okay. It says, how does single family zoning affect affordable housing supply? Any thoughts?
The first thought that just popped in my head had to do with the quality of the existing housing stock, because in San Antonio, especially in our historic and low income areas, there's a lot of housing stock that has the need for rehab, so folks can live in better quality conditions. And that directly impacts the number of units that are affordable, because if that unit deteriorates and it's gone forever, you've lost an opportunity. Now, how that relates to single family zoning, I think that's a question for a planner.
And Pete, there was a question about identifying yourself.
Yes.
That you weren't on the panel list of panel. I
It
think
was a last minute addition, San Antonio Housing Trust
Okay.
Executive Director.
And very welcomed addition. We appreciate
Yes.
it. Thank you so much. So any last words or thoughts before we depart?
There was one question there about Via Link, whether that's an option. Certainly in areas that can't be served by transit, but it's we would not want to use that in lieu of local line service, because it's much more efficient and less costly for line service. But in the areas that are not served by transit and where the Via Link service makes sense, we certainly are studying that throughout the area or throughout the community. So thanks for that question.
Yes, thank you. And this has been a great conversation. I think thanks again to all the panelists, and thanks for all the attendees. Thank you for all the questions. And I just want you to know that we've noted all of the comments made today and all the questions asked, and we will be getting back to you as we move through this process. So everybody have a great afternoon, and thanks again.